Hello, ladies. Thank you for being part of my first interview for Parcha, the Empress Market newsletter. This is a new segment for me. I'm still figuring it out. So I don't know whether it's going to be called Chit Chat and Chai or Gup Shup with the Gals or like something like Pakistani talk show host vibes. So we're playing with some ideas. But yeah, I'll just introduce you. So we've got Rida Bilgrami, who is a fabulous food writer, and she's written for Vice, Eater London, Juggernaut, Goya Journal, and I love your writing and the way that it's like food and anthropology and how food is actually telling so many stories about who we are as people. So yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And then we have Nida Jehangir, who is, a lady who is, powerhouse. She works in tech and finance. Sorry, only from what I listen to. But she writes an amazing blog, London Food Diaries London.
Why cannot my friends get this right? Like, honestly.
Food Diaries London! I know. I did that, and I did practice that, and I was like, "मैं इसको तंग करूँगी." But yeah, Nida not only she obviously blogs and reviews all the amazing restaurants that she eats at, and travels around London, but also her amazing cooking, Pakistani cooking, and the sort of exploration about food and stuff. So I actually. Even through 6 degrees of even smaller degrees of separation with Rida, I know her through so many friends in Pakistan. But I think our friendship, Rida, developed through Bun Kebab and Empress Market. And then and I'll let you guys say, but even with Nida, you turned up at my stall. So, it'd be nice to kind of hear briefly about how our relationships kind of developed in that way, and then your background.
Rida,
maybe you want to go first.
Why would be so polite?
So I don't want to go into the detail again that Rida's Numra just captured in terms of how I got into food. I started blogging around 12 years ago, so I've seen the whole landscape change in the food industry in London. I used to go to a lot of blogger events where I was probably the only Pakistani woman in those events, because with any restaurants in the food industry, PRs and media play a very strong role in how the restaurants are brought up. And eventually, if you're not hearing about a restaurant, that's probably because there's no PR or no one's talking about it. But now, with Instagram, things have changed a lot, so which is great. I think there's a bit of democracy there in terms of who can and can't, who wants to come up, and which is great. Sorry, I don't want to drag on too much, but in terms of, with Numra, I met her, I was always looking for Pakistani food. There wasn't a lot of Pakistani food. There still isn't enough Pakistani food in London or in the UK. And I just bumped into her, I knew of her, but I hadn't met her. So I was one of those losers who just ran up to her in the market. I was like, "Oh my God, you do bun kebab!" And I was like, "Can you please make me this bun kebab?" And actually, at the cheek of me, I was telling Numra how to make my bun kebab. So can I please not put any cucumber in my bun kebab? And can you please not put any of those what do you call them? Crunchy wali tum kya dalti thi unme?
Dal more dalti thi main, haan.
So I was like, "Can you please not add that? I just want simple ande wala shami kebab." And then she's like, "Yeah, don't worry, I'll make it." And that's kind of how we started interacting. And then I got to go to a supper club, and the rest is history. I don't know how long that was.
That was a while ago. I was quite weather worn on that day, and when you said no cucumber, no that more, I'm like, she wants the OG one. So yeah. And Rida as well, how it'd be great to hear about your experience working in the industry and how we met.
Yeah, sure. I was actually just thinking that I think we met at a time when we were in the previous incarnations of our life, or rather the way that parallel lives go. But I just remember obviously meeting you when you were at SOAS, and we were both finishing up graduate school, and then coming to the screening of your documentary that was shot in Lahore on graffiti in the city. And So this was before, obviously, you were working in food, and I was also not working in food because, well, I mean, I've always sort of worked in food because I also work as a sustainability strategist, and my focus in terms of sector has always been food and beverage, was really working with companies in terms of thinking about how they can transition to more sustainable business models when it comes to actually food sourcing, particularly of like commodities like cocoa and coffee and vanilla, the kinds of things that we have in our daily lives. But equally, as you mentioned, my academic background was in anthropology. So I was always really interested in sort of the stories behind what we eat, why we eat it, the social meanings behind like production and consumption of food. And obviously, coming originally from Pakistan, I was just really interested in sort of shining a light on how these issues kind of played out, both in South Asia, but also for the South Asian diaspora. So I remember actually when I started writing professionally, which was about 3 years ago, the first story that I wrote was about the future of British Pakistani food as female. And Numra was one of the chefs who was featured in that. And of course, I mean, if I was thinking of like pitching the story, I mean, the first person I really thought of was Numra because of all the work that you had done on bun kebab. And at that time, you had just done your Empress Market residency as well. And I would always, you know, before that, there was always such a need for a space like that because, you know, we've always had these Pakistani restaurants or the curry houses as they're popularly known as, but they've not necessarily been spaces that have been, you know, where perhaps like Pakistani girlfriends can go and just kind of have, you know, have a chat and have food that is really sort of rooted in heritage and, you know, has a real story behind it. Of course, the kind of like space that you created brought in that Pakistani hospitality element that, you know, we all miss when we live in London. So yeah, I think that kind of covers sort of my entry into food, and that very much intersects with sort of your journey as well. So it's great that we are being able to have this conversation, and I'm so glad that you invited us to be on the first series of this chat.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I mean, you touched on so many of the points that we have in terms of owning public space and our relationship with food. I think, like, that kind of gets me going. Like, obviously, you know, this first issue of Parcha is called An Ode to Juggernaut. It's really about, it kind of is like, the starting point of it is my nani's journey into her love for food, and also, you know, I kind of explore the idea of how she actually did work professionally in the industry to some extent as well, and then it lends itself to the larger relationship women have with food in the grander landscape, like global feminism. And the conversation always has been that, like, you know, classic feminism was like cutting the apron strings, and we don't want to be in the kitchen, and the kitchen was this prison that you wanted to get out of. I mean, and we also just like have, you know, 1992, Hillary Clinton famously was like, I suppose I could have stayed at home and baked cookies, which was actually quite a controversial thing for her to say, but she spoke of a generation of women who were like, if I'm a feminist, if I'm a ballbuster, if I'm like doing anything of value in this world, it's not going to be in the kitchen. And I think, like, what are your thoughts about that? And like, what is your relationship with in food been like in that respect?
I mean, I think this is such an interesting question because I think the kitchen, specifically the domestic kitchen, has always been this contested space in which traditional gender roles have always been sort of, you know, rewritten and explored. And to the point that you just made, I think the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we saw this. And I think, I mean, it's sort of when the second wave of feminism came in terms of, you know, the Feminine Mystique, which was written in 1963, which was really about, okay, how do we get women out of the drudgery of kitchen work and into, you know, professional spaces. And I mean, literally, I think I've even read, how do we get women out of kitchens into boardrooms? And I think the way that I look at it is that it doesn't have to be either or, because I think, you know, making the choice of, you know, I mean, cooking for yourself and cooking for others is really about, you know, like, especially when you're cooking yourself, it is about nourishing yourself. It's about making a choice about what you want to put in your body. It's about knowing how to use ingredients. And I think all of those things are feminist in their own ways. And ultimately, it is about the choice that women make. If that is that they want to bake sourdough or bake cookies, then that's equally their choice, you know? But I think the reason that we saw that movement in the 60s and 70s was that often it felt like women didn't have a choice but to do that because they were sort of constricted in those gender roles. And there was, that brings, the other question that you raised earlier about how we value women's labor, how it was sentimentally prized, but not economically valued. And I think Nigella Lawson has written about this. I think she wrote a piece about 2 or 3 years ago where she talks about the fact that actually criticizing why women are in the kitchen is quite anti-feminist. And I agree with that. I mean, my own personal journey has been, I'm going to try and summarize this, but I haven't lived in sort of my parents' home since I graduated from college when I was 22, which was at the time I was living in Boston, but then I moved to London. And, for the last like 10 to 12 years of my life, cooking for me personally has been very much about, nourishing myself, making very conscious choices about, what I want to put into my body, both from like a nutrition perspective, but also how I feed my own nostalgia, obviously living far away from home. And, but at the same time, like a lot of my other female cousins don't really know how to cook, or perhaps do, but I don't think that that's something that they want to spend their time doing. I'm sure they won't be too happy when they listen to this, if they do. And I think like growing up, I and all my cousins are older than me, so I always sort of kind of heard this, or kind of perhaps internalized it, that, oh, well, like, why would we do this when like women have made so much progress trying to get out of kitchens? And again, that association of cooking with domesticity. And obviously I'm not cooking for others. I mean, I live on my own, I don't have children. So I don't feel the sense of domestic pressure, like, oh my God, I absolutely have to do this because no one else is going to do it. It's very much about doing it for myself. But I also understand that that might be a privileged position to be in, and that's not where everybody might find themselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm keen to hear how sort of Nida relates to this, and yeah, and even how you relate to this, Numra.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a bit different working in restaurant kitchens.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are different levels to this, right? Like, one level is how women have been brought up in Pakistan and in Desi kitchens. It's that requirement. It's sort of like dictated to us that you need to be good at cooking. You need to be good at this, to be able to succeed in life. Like, of course, and I think this is sort of the hypocrisy that exists within our society where, women are pushed. Like, I mean, I guess I can speak from my experience. My parents did push me to excel at school. Like, it was a very important thing for them that I did really well at school. If I wasn't the top 3 student in my class, I was doing something wrong. But at the same time, there was this expectation that I also had to be, at least learn how to make chai. And I think that has been my one thing which I really rebelled against with my mother, because my mom, she knew how irritated I used to get when she was like, go make me chai. And I'd be like, why do I have to make you chai? Like, because she knew, it wasn't because she was like, oh, please, not as like a mother-daughter thing. She wanted to do it so I would learn how to make it. The idea that, in the future, if someone, I had to make chai for someone being my future husband, it would be something I'm ready for. And it would just annoy me so much. At some point, I would, instead of putting sugar in, I would put salt in her chai and to her. Just as my act of rebellion, I was like, there you go, I made you chai now. Yeah, exactly. But like,
hate copy. Sorry, I'm saying the hate copy, the illustrator. I think she's made a cartoon on this. I'm gonna put salt in your chai. Yeah.
Oh my God,
well, I mean, these are one of the things where I actually really, and we're saying like we're very proud that we don't know how to cook. I used to be like, I don't even like chai. Main to coffee peeti hu type, and it was more the idea that I'm rejecting tea on such a level. And I joke a lot about it with people when people ask for a cup of tea. I used to be like, when I was younger, I used to deliberately make a bad cup of tea. Like, I'd make every effort to make a bad cup of tea, just so people would never ask me again. And I just did not. I was rejecting the idea of being in the kitchen in that way. And even for me, like, I don't know how I landed myself into taking food and nutrition. And for my GCSEs, and I used to really struggle in the lessons and stuff, but I ended up always getting, I mean, I don't want to, but I used to have really good grades, even though it's a struggle. But actually the struggle was an unconscious sort of rejection of the idea of being in the kitchen, that I'm like, I'm bad at it because this is not where I'm supposed to be. It's not because I'm not good at it. And I think there's always frustrations where things would turn out right. I wouldn't have pleasure in it. I'd be like, it was so hard, I didn't like being here. And that suddenly lended out. People said, how did you end up working in the kitchen? How did you end up becoming a chef? I was like, I don't know how that happened. It was such a fluke. I was a friend who would buy pre-boiled potatoes from Marks and Spencer's. And I used to say this with so much pride. And I didn't really understand how loaded those comments were, where I was basically rejecting my place in the kitchen. And that sort of like inheritance that I describe it of, like, that your role, you can be good at so many other things, but the most important thing is to be able to cook well, to look after your family, to be a good wife, and to be a good homemaker. And I mean, there's complications in that. And I definitely also want, I mean, I have described that as hypocrisy, but it was only the other night when I was writing for this newsletter, I was like, actually, it was my mom's effort that she didn't want me to struggle. And that is the immigrant experience. That is like, you just want your child to have a better life. You don't want them to be out fighting for their rights, but like, just make your life easy because the world is hard enough. And I thought that was actually, once I kind of almost like, it was like an epiphany moment. I was like, you know what, I don't hold it against her, this hypocrisy that I felt. But I mean, coming back to, my experience, like I started cooking professionally. Obviously, I used to work in television, and I started cooking professionally, but I always, again, was like, I'm not a cook. It's a combination of like that sort of like ickiness of being a chef, but also I later developed that sort of imposter syndrome, which I'll talk about in a later thing. And it was like, it was just really, even when I apply for apprenticeships, I'm not going to say like go into detail with that at this stage, but I find it really hard to get places in kitchens. And I realized when I'd look into, even in an interview position, I'd look into the kitchens. In a desi kitchen, there wouldn't be any women like high-end, restaurants in town. Curry houses are very like, you only see men on the front of house and in the kitchen. You won't see any women. And again, like looking at the stats, like 2018, only 17% of like the chef positions in the UK are held by women. And I find that contradiction so interesting, because you'd have all the greatest chefs, like what inspired you? And they talk about their nonnas and their grandmothers and their mums in the kitchens. And here they are, like, running these things and acting like these rock stars. And these stories of them working to like 2 a.m, like being all these like hard-hitting, swearing and beating things and blah blah blah, is like celebrated. And it wasn't a very like safe space for a woman. It wasn't a space for them to be encouraged to be in. And like you said, like the market value, like women's labor has no value. And I think, what are your thoughts? Like, Nida, you touched on how the industry has changed in terms of marketing, but have you noticed that sort of change in the way that people are making the food that you eat at restaurants?
I think you have to look at it in different phases, right? Like the first phase, the way that came in is we started seeing a lot more, well, not a lot more, a few more women chef on TV. And that was mostly your Western media. And I think I want to go back to where you said that, everyone starts, looking into food and loving food. That love and the whole idea of nurturing comes from their homes, like their moms, their grandmas, etc. But there's this difference between how women interpret the food versus men. And this has been talked about quite a bit as well, where women like you have a very strong connection with your nani, right? Like your grandmother. You talk about like, how your inspiration came from the kitchen, and you want to take that further and celebrate that. Whereas for men, it's inherently been, oh yeah, I can, of course that inspiration came, but I want to do better. Like I want to make it even better. Like as if there was something wrong, or there wasn't something enough, like it wasn't punchy enough what they had. So you also have to look at it from a psychological perspective, like, the psychology of women versus men. Women were always seen as nurturing, men were always seen as the breadwinners. So of course, when it comes to homes, we want our women to be in the kitchen, as, they said, women belong in the kitchen. But when it comes to making money out of that, we're like, no, that's sort of where people start to get a bit, that's probably where men need to step in and start earning the money and be backed by, you know, VCs, investors, etc. I think we'll go into more details later, but in terms of how things have changed, I don't like, on the surface level, of course, people are talking about it. I think that's how things have changed, but in terms of what actually has changed in the industries, I don't think this is an issue inherently within the food industry. I think it's an industry-wide issue where there has been a lot of disparity between genders, and wherever there have been less women compared to men, you will see this kind of attitude very prevalent. And that's where you need to start talking about why that is. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'm sure we'll cover that later. So my is still, you know, we're still not there. At least we're talking about it, but not enough.
Yeah. I mean, you are saying like, we're talking about it, but not enough. Is it only a lot of talk and there's no action? I mean, the thing again, like, it does almost shake you and like make you sort of kind of make my blood boil. I kind of always refrain from using like food metaphors, but it makes my blood boil. But like, you know, in Tom Kerridge's like 2014 comments, like really hit headlines were like girls in the kitchen. He's like, he likes girls in the kitchen, but felt that women lack a lot of that fire in a chef's belly that you need. And everyone obviously was like banging their pots and pans. And then we had, I mean, and most recently we had the amazing and fabulous and trailblazing Marco Pierre White saying in 2019, suggested that women were too emotional and not strong enough to carry heavy pans. And you know, he has a much longer sort of quote, and I mean, again, this is something I'm going to discuss on my Instagram for Empress Market and in the newsletter. And someone has said that to me specifically, that tum patiliyan kaise uthaogi, when I requested an internship at a specific restaurant, and I went away being like, in my head I was just like, with both my hands, I'm really confused by your response, this abstract question. And I mean, I kind of internalized a lot of like, should I even ask these questions? Should I even ask for this opportunity if this person feels this way about me? But while both of them were really, really criticized by the industry, where both of them were really, you know, people describe Marco Pierre White as like a, you know, a rambling dinosaur. And it was like, you know, this sort of attitude is not welcome. Again, you look at kitchens and there'll be like one lonely woman in a sea of men, and we're celebrating it. But like, I mean, yeah, like Rida, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you feel that is kind of translating really in conversations about the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was also sort of remembering the comments made by Marco Pierre White, because that's the one that's sort of in my most recent memory. And then, of course, I think there were some, you know, chefs who obviously, you know, kind of raised their voice against that and said that, you know, this is such a sexist comment, and there's no reason to believe that women can't, you know, lift heavy pans. Or sometimes it's not just about, you know, whether they can't do that sort of labor, but it's also about, well, they have children and their families to take care of, so they can't work the timings that are required to work in restaurants and that sort of a thing. But, you know, I think I think change is starting to happen, or at least these conversations are out into the mainstream. They're making it into the mainstream press. But whether anything is really starting to change within restaurant kitchens, I think that perhaps is just too slow. I mean, you know, obviously we have, you know, people who are really trying to make a shift in the industry, whether it's Asma Khan and her all-female kitchen. And of course she has, you know, she's talked about how she creates schedules that allow her kitchen staff, or I mean, whether it's the chefs or even front of house, to be able to go and spend time with their families. And she doesn't believe people should be working beyond a certain number of hours and that sort of a thing. But I mean, these are still very niche examples, and you know, it almost feels like they're outliers to the industry rather than becoming the norm. And I think, as Nida correctly said, that what's happening here is really just reflective of how other industries are as well. I mean, I think obviously the restaurant industry does have, you know, it does get press. It, you know, it is under a microscope because it's so consumer facing. I mean, we all go to restaurants. We all are really interested in knowing more about sort of what goes on behind the scenes. And increasingly there is more conversation, especially after COVID-19, on labor conditions. And this actually brings, I hope I'm not going off on a tangent, but you know, I think in the last couple of years, And obviously with the rise of, more environmental considerations for people as part of their diets, there's been a lot of conversation around how can restaurants be more sustainable. And the way we've seen them talk about it is around, well, we don't have food waste, or we're recycling this amount of food, or we are working with these charities and all these philanthropic endeavors, or we're using, renewable energy, and all of that is great. But to me, that feels very piecemeal. I mean, I think you can't talk about running sustainable business unless you're also talking about labor conditions. I mean, I'm not that interested if the carbon footprint of the cabbage I'm eating is lower, if the person who's like scrubbing the pots is like making below minimum wage. Like that to me is, as somebody who's dining in restaurants, is just unacceptable. And the reality is we just don't know. We don't know. And I mean, who stops going to restaurants if they don't know what the social conditions of the workers are, And I think now that's becoming more and more something that people are talking about, but it's only happened after COVID-19. I wish it didn't take a pandemic for that conversation to begin. But I think maybe now with the conversation on labor conditions, this is going to, because this is where I think the intersection of class and gender and economic value of labor and safe working conditions, I think this is all connected. And this is where I think we may start to see change, but I mean, I'm being cautiously optimistic.
I mean, completely. I mean, this is touching on 2 points. In the wider industry, for me, I feel like you have to, if you want to work in the food industry, you have to be working till 2, 3 in the morning. You're surrounded by a lot of aggressive personalities, and you have to be kind of like always performing above that. There is, to speak quite candidly, there is very casual use of drugs. There's very casual use of drinking while working, just to keep the momentum and to keep the energy going. And it's very, very, it feels toxic is the only word to describe it. I very almost deliberately, like I've touched into it on a few occasions, and then I'd step out of it because it's just quite overwhelming to be in that environment. And then I'd have it from the other side where I've still kind of worked up in the industry. And in September, I was working I had the opportunity to be the head chef of a last autumn, winter, to be the head chef of this restaurant up in Tottenham. And it was amazing. The guys who were running it were absolutely fabulous. I loved what they were doing. But I had the unique opportunity of having someone who was an assistant to me, who has worked in all these lovely fancy restaurants. And he had the audacity to say to me that I am not a chef, I am a cook, because I haven't gone through that process. I am not a chef, I am a cook, because I have this trial by fire. I don't know. How do I not know how to make X, Y, and Z dishes? How am I even asking him how to make these things? And then I was like, you're in my kitchen. Do you know how to make this desi dish? Do you know how to do that? And he'd be like, no. And I'm like, I have actually gone to culinary school. I do know a lot of these, these techniques you're describing. But he'd constantly be like, he'd say to my face, like, you're not a chef and you're a cook. And then he'd go on. I think the one thing that really pushed me over the edge and I would just keep my head down, like being a good, obedient, desi girl was just like, keep on working, just listen to it, whatever. I think what pushed me over the edge was, but again, he messaged it, I have it in writing, and I saved it on my phone because I want to remember that someone thought that they could talk to me like this, was that he said, you have this zero passion and what you're doing is bullshit. I'm a woman who am cooking my grandmother's dishes. Everything I do there's so much passion and so much like purpose in it. And I talk so much about it. You can see it in the food that I'm serving on the table, and to say that I have zero passion. Really, like, I was just like, oh my God, like this person there's something else that's going on. And I don't want to get into that, but I immediately sent the screen grabs to my bosses, and they were amazing. Their response was immediately like, this is a fireable offense. You can't talk to your line manager. I mean, I don't want to pull rank, but I was just like, I wanted to work with him. And I think he, like, as opposed to him working for me, and I think he kind of took that as an opportunity to really dig into me in that way. And I feel like that sort of respect for like female chefs and people who've come in through the industry, like Asmahan, again, I love what she does, is because she's not saying that like, you don't have to be working in a kitchen as a kitchen KP from 16 and then work your way up. You come into the industry from different places and we'll make space for you.
Yeah.
And I mean, that has been my direct thing. And I always saw the industry that way. I didn't want to get into the industry from the traditional ways because I was like, so aware of those stereotypes. And I was like, those stereotypes are so real. And for me, like, yeah, like I internalized a lot of that, that bullshit. no other way to describe it. But I also kind of was like, when he did that, and I'm like, who the hell do you think you are? But yeah, I think the sort of ideas between a cook and a chef, a female chef and a chef, I think are so interesting. I just went off on one because I was just like, it's so bad. But like, I mean, yeah, like those ideas of like where my place is, and because the journey I've taken, I mean, the sort of like career path I've had. Again, I'd like, what are your thoughts, Nida, like in terms of what it means to be, to be a woman in the kitchen, and to take that title and that gender responsibility and just be a chef, be someone who's cooking for work and passion.
I mean, so obviously I'm not a professional chef. I'm like, a home cook. But like, even growing up, when there was this expectation for me to learn how to cook and stuff, I had, I guess, a privilege to rebel against it because, I didn't really have to learn how to cook, but I still wanted to because it was something that I really enjoyed. I loved watching. And at that point, we got cable TV, so we had BBC Food, watching the early days of Jamie Oliver and all these different chefs. And you're like, wow, there's this whole world. And you're watching Bill Granger. So there was this whole world that was opened up to me in terms of the food. So I loved going into the kitchen and just experimenting myself. And my parents used to call me, and they still call me moody chef, because I would only cook if I wanted to. But if someone asked me to cook for them, I'd be like, no, I'm not cooking. So that was my act of rebellion. Like, no, I'll cook for you when I want to cook for you, not when you expect me to cook for you. So it was that thing that, no, I own this, I make my own decisions. Like, I can't be told. And I think growing up in a Pakistani environment, in that sort of environment, you're constantly rebelling against the idea that you have to do this because you're expected to do it. And my idea was, I was like, no, I'm going to do it because I want to do it, not because you're telling me to do it. It's because I really want to do it. And I just want to quickly touch on this whole subject of how the kitchens were built, right? The kitchens were inherently built by, I think there was a French chef, Auguste, who set up the guild system. It was set up to be run like a military operation. And
big brigadier system, yeah.
So, it's that level of rigor that was required. And you had to be strong and you had to lift things. So, there was no place for a woman in that system. And inherently, any money-making industry, any industry where people have to work, there were not spaces for women to excel in or to work in. And that's what's across any industry. So it's only women who've been able to make the position felt, and they're very few and far in between. And I think I'd like to call out Ravneet as well from Counter Talk, because she herself was, a chef who'd worked in different areas. She really struggled with some of the experiences, and that really spurred her to make a change. And I think in our generation, she's the one who's sort of been the one who sort of started saying, no, we need to change that. And now you're very vocal around this as well. And I think we need women like you and her to be constantly talking about it and saying, no, this is not okay, because of course we've all experienced racism at workplace, discrimination at workplace, but to stay quiet now, I think, is a disservice to ourselves and also the people who get affected by it, because not everyone's strong enough to speak about it. I will talk about imposter syndrome later, because I know we're really short on time, but there's something really interesting that I do want to raise around that. But back over to Rida.
Rida.
I think Nida picked up on the race element as well, which is what I wanted to bring in, because as you were sharing your experience, Numra, I mean, part of what I was thinking was that not only is there sort of sexism at play there, and sort of the devaluation of a woman's skills, and sort of this, even if you just look at it from a terminology perspective, chef versus cook, but there's also an element about women of color in the kitchen, which I think it's only in the last couple of years that we've seen more women of color in professional kitchens now really sort of blazing the trail, winning accolades in the UK. I'm talking about a sort of a Western context, but equally, if you look in Pakistan, how many restaurants have women in the kitchen who are cooking? You may have like women who come from very, well-to-do families who might be financing these restaurants, but they're not the ones who are actually standing in the kitchen for 10 to 12 hours cooking. But, so I think the race, and I mean, it's, again, the intersectionality of it, which is, it's a combination of both misogyny as well as racism that kind of gets in the, is hampering women's access to opportunities. But there's two things. I mean, one are systemic barriers, so it's about whether women have access to opportunities, access to capital, investment. But the other is really about how do we change these mindsets? And to be honest, I don't have an answer other than the fact, like Nida said, that I think more and more women need to just be vocal. And I know that's probably not possible for everybody to be, because not everybody really wants to sort of, stick their neck out, or doesn't necessarily have the language around which they want to talk about these things, or perhaps just want to, kind of what you said, just, get on with the work, because all of this is very emotionally exhausting. And again, it's emotional labor that women, and especially women of color, need to be doing, because they don't have enough allies in the industry to speak up for them and to really demand systemic change. And we see this across food media as well. I mean, there's been so much talk about cultural appropriation. I know Nida has views on this as well. And just sort of like even what we saw in the last couple of months, I mean, a lot of this plays out on Twitter and other social media platforms, but, you've got a lot of restaurants and chefs putting up these black squares, talking about Black Lives Matters, but then, they're not going to say anything against a very racist restaurant critic, just because they don't want to break out of this sort of, bro club, or whatever you want to call it. And part of that is, I think, sometimes just British political correctness and not wanting to be confrontational or vocal, but it's at the expense of many other people, particularly people of color across the industry, whether they're working as writers, chefs, photographers, stylists. I mean, I think it's widespread. And
widespread?
Widespread, yeah. I mean, I never thought about it that way, but yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, again, for me, when we're saying about being vocalizing these feelings, I have felt this certainly working in television as well when I was working. And I my silence has come not from a place of, I don't want to rock the boat, I don't want to do that. But for me, it's almost like when you experience trauma, is like, is this really happening to me? And not like to me as in to me, but it's more like, am I actually experiencing real racism right now? Am I really experiencing real sexism right now? And there's so many ways I'm like, no, it wasn't that. He was doing something else. He wasn't that. He was a bully. My boss wasn't being rude to me because I was Pakistani. She was bullying me because of this, that, the other. I'd always make all these excuses for it, because I was trying to be like, it wasn't even like I'm making excuses for them. It was mainly me going, I don't want to be in that position where this thing happened to me, and I don't want to be a victim. I am a fighter. I am like balls of steel. This is what I'm going to get through it. Shit doesn't hit me. Shit doesn't affect me. I get hobira. And I think that's something like, I'd be like, no, actually, like it was almost like a process of like going through some sort of like dealing with my mental health, being like, actually, no, I've gone through something really messed up, and I need to call this shit out, because it's not okay, and I'm not going to internalize it. I'm going to be like, just bat it back and be like, who the hell do you think you are? And at my ripe age of by some standards overripe age of 34, I was just like, who the hell do you think you are? Like, I was like, for me, I was just like, really, is this how you feel? Screen grab, send it to my boss. And I said to them, I was like, if this man is in the kitchen the next day, I am not coming in. And they were like 100%. It's like, we are so sorry that this has happened to you in our premises. And those guys were amazing. I think again and again, like, I mean, circumstances have happened that I'm like, okay, fine, I have to move on from that role. But I would have happily stayed there, because they were running such an amazing place. But the guy that they had as an assistant was just such like a textbook experience of what it is I feel to be in the industry, of what women's labor is, what a woman of color's labor is, what the value of the skill that I'm bringing. There was none in his eye.
And Numra, it sort of also reminds me that, we have also seen some high profile cases of, male chefs. I don't like to use the term male and female chefs, because that's kind of what we want to move away from. but for the sake of this argument,
Mm.
being accused of sexual harassment in the workplace. And then, of course, everybody sort of condemning it in the moment. But then I think re-emerging a year or two later, as if, and then by that time people just have like short-term memory. And it's kind of like, okay, well, you can rebuild yourself. And I mean, we've sort of seen this with the Me Too movement as well. Like, to what extent does it actually ruin a man's career? And in some cases it has, and there has been a sense of accountability. But I don't know if in the restaurant industry particularly there is. So, I mean, this experience you're describing, I mean, here you were supported by the people who were running the restaurant, the business, in terms of really taking a stand for you. And that's great to see. But is that really how all bosses are? Perhaps not. And the person you're describing is probably going to go on and get a job somewhere else and be creating, I mean, are they really going to learn a lesson? I hope that they do, and they feel, a sense of, like they do some soul searching and think about sort of what their role in a restaurant kitchen is and how they can treat women with respect. But equally, I just feel like this is still so rampant because I don't know if the accountability mechanisms are there. And sometimes it perhaps maybe the court of public opinion. I mean, when these things come out, like people should just not really support these chefs and their businesses. But I know that's easier said than done.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, I do think that, the court of public opinion is very, very powerful, and it can certainly shut people down, not to kind of like encourage cancel culture, but I think we need to hold us as people accountable for these sort of things, because I feel like a lot of the industry is just like, English politeness is very much a real problem, where they do not want to rock the boat and don't want to put ourselves in awkward situations. And it's just like, like change is often really hard in that. I am conscious, but I mean, I think it was just, Nida, do you have anything to add?
We talk about this forever.
I know, exactly.
I mean, I think we definitely needed more time to, there's so much I wanted to cover and speak to you girls about it. But I think there's one thing that I would urge you girls to read. There's this really good article called Stop Telling Women They've Got Imposter Syndrome, because a lot of it really stems from, and it was written by two authors, Richika and Jodie Ann. So it's on Harvard Business Review, so just Google it.
I'll check it out.
It's a really good article around, why sometimes, this whole thing, when we've started talking about race, especially in the last year or so, unconscious bias and imposter syndrome has really come up, and that's great. But I think people are also using it as a token thing to just use that as a conversation. Okay, let's just give you some unconscious bias training, and how we can understand what imposter syndrome is. But actually, imposter syndrome is not just about someone feeling like they're not worthy enough. It's also a lot of stuff you've internalized over time that you've grown up with. I mean, the sort of things we grew up as women of color, there's so much stuff we grow around which we think is normal. It's only when in my 20s and 30s I realized actually that's not normal. So you have to like unravel that in your mind to say, okay, well, whatever was happening was not normal. So I need to rewire my brain. And then think around unconscious bias. Like, no, not everything is unconscious, right? Some people have a conscious bias, which is, something they take actions on, and it's with intent. So there's that level of critical thinking that we need to have. Like, not everything is binary. Like, like you were saying, people have this way of like how the industry should be. Times change. We have to change with those times. Of course, how things were set up, how organizations were set up. They were set up for a generation that it worked for. We're not that generation anymore, and the generation that's coming after us, definitely not. So how are we moving with that? Because very quickly, the next generation will start to reject these industries and organizations because they don't cater to everybody. So, not everything is binary. So we have to really understand, like, if we want to change something, we have to look at what are the causes of these problems are before we say, oh, let's do some training, or let's talk about it. But sorry, I don't want to take too much time because I know we're
no. I mean, yeah, I completely agree, and I think, yeah, unconscious bias. We can have so many other conversations, and I think like this is certainly showing us that I think there'll be a part 1, part 2, part 3 like of this conversation. So I'm actually quite excited. And I thought, yeah, I mean, I was like, I don't know what the format of this segment is yet, but I can see it, and it's done by the end of this conversation. I know exactly what I want. I mean, and it's only like, it's not, I mean, I love it that Rida named our WhatsApp group Teen Hasinas, and I think that's what, like, the conversation that we have is like, you know, a complete rejection of that idea of internalizing these things. And yeah, it was absolutely fabulous talking to both of you today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
No, wow, my pleasure. And we're going to be doing this again. Pardon?
Rida, when are you coming back? We need
yeah.
In like about 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Hopefully
so should we, in true Desi's fashion, shall we give you a list of things you want?
Definitely. I mean, inshallah, by the time I'm back, hopefully we can actually meet in person as well, because then restrictions will be like, you know, easing up. And then although I mean, the virtual format is great as well, but it'll be great to actually, you know, even do this in person. Maybe
definitely.
We can eat, drink chai, and do some gupshup.
Exactly. We have been drinking our tea. I had planned this appropriately, and I've gotten through it at the end. So thank you once again. And yeah, have a good day, ladies. Enjoy.
Thank you. And yeah, look forward to everything that you sort of put out with Parcha as well. So keen to see
glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.